Simon said, be seated. It's wonderful to be in worship together this morning on this third Sunday in the season of Lent, and we are in a series called Listen for Grace. And in all the noise that is around us and all that we have to listen to and to pay attention to and trying to sort through what's important and what's not, what's helpful and what's not, what's true and what's not, in all of that noise, listening for grace is an important spiritual exercise. Because God's grace shows up sometimes in unlikely ways. And we have to be attuned to that. And so that's our goal for this season of Lent, to be especially attuned to God's grace. We heard from the book of Exodus a moment ago, and the words of the Ten Commandments take place really in the middle of a story. And so it's important for us to remind ourselves of that story. The children of Israel, the people of Israel, have been slaves in Egypt for generations, generation after generation, for a very long time. They were slaves. And God sets them free through the leader named Moses. And through God's activity and this amazing series of events, the people who have been slaves for generations, who have never known anything but slavery in Egypt in the most difficult circumstances, they're free. And they're free all of a sudden. And they're not quite sure what to make of this and how to live in this new state. In fact, it's only just a few days before they're complaining, and some of them are longing to go back to Egypt because of the predictability and the security that they found there of sorts, houses to live in and that kind of thing. And then they become thirsty, and they find water, but the water is not fit to drink. It's bitter. But God gives Moses the means to make that water sweet, fit to drink, and their thirst is quenched. But there's still something missing. They're missing something really important. And then they become hungry, and they yearn for the food that they had in Egypt, such as it was. And then God gives them the manna. The bread from heaven. Manna is sort of bread-like. In fact, the word manna means, what is it? They don't really know exactly what it is, but it's food, and it nourishes them. And so they've got water to drink, and they've got food to eat, but they're still complaining, and something is obviously missing from their lives as a community, or trying to be a community. Then they run into problems with the Amalekites, and they go to war. They battle the Amalekites, and God protects them, and they prevail. And so they have food, they have water, they have protection, and all of this is God's gracious provision, but there's something still missing. And it's so important, and we can see the symptom of it missing, because the people are in such disputes with one another that Moses is having to sit, as the text says, from sunup until sundown as judge, settling disputes among the people. And it's at that time, about 3 months to the day after they have been set free from slavery in Egypt, that they receive this great gift of grace. It's the gift of limitation. Now, as Mr. Mark said a moment ago, limitation is really important when you're doing almost anything. In the area of creativity, Reed Arvin, who came to our church and spoke to our staff some years ago, named several engines of creativity, and one of those engines of creativity is limitation. And so, for example, if I said to you, I want you to write me a poem, what is your emotional response to that? Blank page syndrome. How do I start? What do I do? But if I said, write me a poem about trees and make it a haiku with 17 syllables and in the pattern of 5, 7, 5 and 3 lines, then then you know what I'm talking about. And then you have a little container for creativity. And in that container, creativity can flourish. If I were to say to you, write me a story, well, that's just wide open. But if I said, write me a story about a dog and an elephant, and it has to be 4 pages long, then you've got a container that holds that creativity and allows it to flourish. Limitations are important almost everywhere. Think about a mountain stream. What is it that makes it clear and flowing and it keeps moving? It's limitation. It's the banks of it. Yesterday I went for a walk close to our house, and there's a spring that feeds a creek, and it moves down from a hill. And that water is clear, and it's bubbling, and it's very pleasant, makes pleasant sounds. It's nice to look at. And then when it reaches the bottom of the hill, there are no more channels. There's no more limitation. It just kind of spreads out, and it becomes really a swamp. That's the difference. It's the limitation that makes it so pleasing, and it's the lack of limitation that makes it not so much. And so it is with this notion of being a people, being God's people, being in community. The thing that they were lacking all this time was not water, as important as that is. They got that. And not food, as important as that is, of course. And even protection, as important as it is. But it's this gift of limitation. And it's such a major gift that all of the things you would expect whenever God appears in the Old Testament are there. I mean, all of them. In other places when God appears, you have some of them, but here you have them all. You have a mountain, you have darkness, you have lightning, you have thunder, you have fire, you have long, loud trumpet blasts, you have smoke, you have earthquakes. All of it saying this is a really big deal, this gift that God is giving. And Moses goes up on the mountain, and he comes back with this gift of limitation. That's what it is. It's the law. And part of the law is the Ten Commandments that we heard a moment ago. It's like a container that allows people to have freedom. It's a container that allows community to form, this limitation. And it's a great gift of God. It's grace. Limitation is so often grace. And grace so often manifests itself as limitation. So it's the law. It's the Ten Commandments. It's how to relate to God, and a reminder that we're not God. And that's the first part of the Ten Commandments. And then there's that bridge about the Sabbath that reminds us of human dignity and the need that we all have. We're not God. We learned that in the first part. There is only one God. And then we need Sabbath. We need rest. If God had to rest, how much more do we need to rest? And so there is this Sabbath time, this time of re-energizing. And in that Sabbath time, especially when the Ten Commandments are told in the book of Exodus, is also a reminder that you're not a slave anymore. You don't have to work all the time, 24/7. You're free to take care of yourself as well, and to take care of those who work for you. And so that's an important bridge then to how we treat others. And the last part of the Ten Commandments is all about how we treat one another and how we respect one another. And this is all limitation. And it's a great, great gift. When you think about limitation, you have to think of limitation as critical for freedom. We tend to think of a list of rules as restricting our freedom, but not so. Rules, law, enables us to be free. The experiment that was done many years ago with children on a playground, you take away the fence and they huddle toward the middle because they feel nervous, unsure, a little bit vulnerable. But you put the fence back and then they can spread out all over the playground and enjoy the whole playground. It's limitation. Or can you imagine if we would really be free to travel anywhere if there were no traffic laws? I was talking to one of our members just before the service started, and she's about to go to Italy. And I was telling her, when you go to Italy, if you drive, do not drive in Naples. Because there are no traffic laws in Naples. Well, there may be laws, but they don't pay attention to them. And you'll see police officers just standing watching the chaos. I mean, it's just complete chaos. And we didn't know any better. Later, we were talking to someone who's from Naples, and when she found out we had driven in Naples, she said this, she really said this, "Mamma mia, you drove in Naples?" She said, "Italians don't drive in Naples." Because there are no laws. We wanted to get 2 blocks. We could see our destination, and we could not get there. It took, I don't know how long it took us to get there, because there was no freedom. And there was no freedom because there were no limits. And everyone was doing what he pleased or what she pleased, and so it was chaos. Will and Ariel Durant, in their book, Lessons from History, say this: the first condition of freedom is its limitation. Make it absolute and it dies in chaos. The first condition of freedom is its limitation. Make it absolute and it dies in chaos. And you can say the first condition of community is its limitation. The first condition of creativity is its limitation. You could make a long list of how important and how much limitation is a gift of grace. So the 10 Commandments as a container have limits. They're all prohibitions. Well, most of them. Not all of them, most of them. There's the honoring of parents and there's the Sabbath keeping. But most of them are prohibitions. And when something happens like Hurricane Harvey or some disaster happens, you can obey the 10 Commandments fully and do nothing. Because they are limitation, but they themselves are limited in their effect. And they're not the whole law. So Jesus comes along and says, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fill it up, to fulfill it. And they ask him the question, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus went back to the law, to Deuteronomy, and said, well, the first is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. He got that right out of the law that the people received in the wilderness. And he brought that to the forefront. And he created a limitation that is much stronger and much more life-giving. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And that fulfills all the law and the prophets, Jesus said. And that limitation enables freedom and enables community. The Apostle Paul in Galatians is writing to the church there, and he's writing about freedom. In fact, sometimes people call the book of Galatians the Christian Declaration of Independence. He says, for freedom Christ has set us free. And he says, don't, my brothers and sisters, use your freedom as an excuse for self-indulgence, but be servants to one another. Hear the limitation? Be servants to one another. For the law is summarized in this word, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says this, he says, if you bite and devour one another, be careful that you don't eat one another up. What he's pointing to is freedom without limits is an excuse for self-indulgence. Freedom without limits, people begin to bite and devour one another. Is there any of that going on today? Any biting and devouring going on? The limits to freedom are what enable us to have community. And one of those limits is to love God, and another of those limits is to love our neighbor as ourself, and to use our freedom, as Paul said, to serve one another. That creates this kind of container, a place where we can thrive, a place where people can have life abundant, a place, a container where we can be truly free. And this is God's gift of grace. Amen.